What height or how many floors will the world's tallest building in 2050 have, and why do you say that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's most likely that in 2050 the tallest building will be at the height of 1,000 meters, kilometer, the kind of logical, aspirational height, that symbolic height that we're already seeing under development. Truly taller buildings than that don't really make economic sense, and the proliferation of any towers, the logic really of any towers, is based on a business plan of economics. So the idea of building the world's tallest for bragging rights at some point exceeds the repayment in terms of notoriety. And so I think it's most likely that tall buildings in their multitude will remain at a logical economic height. And that's most likely, I think, to be around 30, 40, 50 stories.
See, that's interesting. I've heard a few people say a mile high. Why not? That's the next milestone. What do you think of that?
It's always been, well, not always been possible, but historically for probably 30 years we would have been able to build a mile-high building. Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, famously predicted that early on, but in particular in the 40s and 50s. And I know some structural engineers have validated the basic concept of the structural system that would take us that high. But the issues of vertical transportation, but most importantly, the constraints of economics are the things that I think argue against that as a really logical development.
Right, sure. If you could select a major tall building design, development, operations, management, research topic that you think needed more work, that was particularly urgent, what would it be and why? Well,
at the conference I was very pleased to hear the report on the ongoing research of the CTBUH on density and sustainability. Producing data that will actually quantify what the values of density, of what I like to call vertical density, where the usage of the land is concentrated in a way that takes together the advantages of mass transportation and the sharing of communal public space at the ground level, seems to me the most logical, sustainable way to move forward with the exploding population worldwide. So making a convincing argument based on data that a model of energy consumption is sustainable, more sustainable in high-rise urban situations, dense urban situations, seems to me a very important fundamental logic to apply to a much broader public argument in favor of tall buildings.
It seems in cities where there's already tall building booms or already very dense urban cores, and New York is a great example, to a certain extent it's almost a foregone conclusion, but it's a different question in other parts of the world where densification hasn't happened in nearly the same way. So I guess zeroing in a little more on the topic of sustainability and density, are there research topics within that, or discussions, debates that you find the most interesting? Or
well, I've been trying to promote this idea of embracing the term vertical density.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
Yeah, well, if a number of years ago, the Skyscraper Museum looked at Hong Kong and New York, comparing especially Manhattan and Hong Kong, which have exactly the same density of population, about 70,000 people per square mile, but absolutely different, opposite proportions of public space or built space and open space. In Shanghai, it's about in Hong Kong, it's about 73%. In New York, it's about 25% open space. So you can have places that are characterized as high-rise cities, as signature skyscraper global cities that succeed on a world stage in terms of their economy, in terms of the built environment there, the modernization process, that have opposing models of the way that land is used. And so I think the idea of density should be reconceived not as an average of space divided by population, where everything is an average, but where in a kind of point of analysis you are able to see how the densification of space, the densification of energy in terms of people living on the land in concentrated areas, then is complemented by the open space, public space, advantages of nature spaces that benefit us all, whether it's for recreation or oxygen.
Is there any precedent for the current tall building boom in architectural history? Not the scale, obviously, but the concerns over losing, the human intimacy and runaway environmental degradation that we see? Or is this a particularly contemporary debate?
Well, as a historian, it's extremely interesting for me to be here in Shanghai and to see the urbanization process, which I think can easily be seen as a 100-year later repetition of the very same forces that grew the skyscrapers and the megalopolis of New York or Chicago. That turn of the 20th century really is a culmination in terms of the aspirations of height and the densification of the urban condition in New York especially, of a process that had started about a generation before, an urbanization, industrialization process that began to concentrate headquarters in the city, the immigration process that brought workers into close proximity with the urban condition that provided for commerce and merchandising. So the cities of Shanghai and the Chinese cities you see today that are growing their skyscrapers as an image of ambition and identity is very similar to the forces of capitalism that produced the Woolworth building or the insurance company buildings, the Singer Tower or the Equitable building. So I think the historical cycle is very much the same, although the particular conditions of place, of the politics and the land planning issues is quite different.
No, it's really, and you kind of preempted my next question. It's fundamentally the same then, the current Asian tall building boom, or Middle Eastern and East Asian tall building boom at least, to the booms we saw in Europe and especially in the US about 100 years ago. But in what ways is it different?
I think the current booms that you see in super tall building construction and indeed the proliferation of tall towers in Chinese cities and in the Middle East are driven by different fundamental forces. In China, it's the pressures of population and urbanization and a political scheme that has decided that urbanization is the future of the country. In the Middle East, there's a market that needs to be created for high-rise buildings by attracting, whether it's in Dubai, residential, recreational, shopping, retail forces. So there are different motivations there. But what I think is most fundamentally different between the Chinese cities and the American cities at the turn of the 20th century is who controls the land. The opportunities for individual capitalistic investment were completely different in New York and Chicago. Great fortunes were created through entrepreneurial, first development of residential and then commercial buildings, so that the investment in real estate portfolios that produced the great families of New York who owned many buildings and who created the concentration of skyscrapers around the transportation nodes. All those forces came from a deeply competitive capitalistic environment, and they were also in New York after 1916 constrained by a zoning law that shaped the city and the skyline in very determinative ways. And so the combination of land use and planning and individualistic competition in New York and Chicago created a great heterogeneity of intense built environment with an enormous amount of differentiation and individualization. But what you see in the Chinese cities today with a master plan which is implemented under a much faster scale is determined more by decisions that are made at a political level.